Good morning or evening.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Pretty good, I guess, all things considered.
All right. Have you seen this one?
No, probably not.
You got Jay Dyer down here in the right corner, and then what, Scott Smith on top of him. He's a 69-year-old Gnostic. I watched some of it maybe a couple years ago. Thought it'd be interesting though because you said you lean towards Gnosticism, and I lean towards Eastern Orthodoxy, so that could be interesting.
I don't know if it's the same type of Gnosticism, right? But sure. Like there are Gnostics that don't believe in the Bible, right? So if a Gnostic doesn't believe in the Bible, then they're in heresy. That's what I meant by that. There are Gnostics that think that God is like that Jesus is part of the demiurge or some crap like that, or this true light that's and the God of the Bible is the demiurge God, the created, uncreated God of the true God. And I don't think they think that's silly because where do they get that idea from? Where's the first witness into that, and where is its testimony? And if there isn't none, then it's just like the deist problem. They have this account of a God but no witness. And so I'm not a Gnostic in that sense. Like I said, it's a different perspective. But
Who do
yeah,
you
let's go
know?
ahead and watch it. Go ahead.
Okay. Who do you know as a Christian Gnostic?
Well, theoretically, Christ would be one, and then all the disciples would be Gnostic in the sense that they actually witness Christ and his resurrection. Like they would be true Gnostics because they have knowledge, they are aware, and they lived and breathed it, and their testimony um, in bearing witness to Christ's resurrection also plays in that. They never fell away and said Christ wasn't the Son of God and that God was a demiurge. At least I hope.
Well,
Some
they
people say
they
Thomas did, but
they doubted him. They flew from him. Peter denied him. Thomas didn't believe him. So there's there's circumstance there where they doubted and
at
removed
some
themselves.
point, at some point, yeah, right, they did. Now, if you want to say they doubted after he was resurrected, then we're arguing a different type of faith, I think. But I don't think
Yeah,
like to the point. I'm not denying what you're saying. I'm just saying that to a point they did, but then after a certain point they kept in faith. Like there was no right. I
but
don't think anyone can.
how would you
Go
have
ahead.
the idea of you being a Gnostic and comparing it to Jesus and the disciples having real space and time interaction? How could you attribute that to a Christian Gnostic today? Where do they fall into that idea?
Well, theoretically, every Christian's Gnostic, in that they should know God by um, his fruits and his works the same way,
Why does that make
right?
them Gnostic?
Gnostic is again Gnostic by definition just means knowing.
Yeah, but it's attached to a philosophical position. So if you want to say that Christians have knowledge revealed from God, that's different than calling them a Gnostic. You're sort of crossing into a different domain by doing that.
I understand
Gnostic.
there's the school of thought that's called Gnosticism.
Well, why use the
Uh,
word to confuse if you're not a Gnostic?
I can't help if the word confuses
You
people,
can use the
right?
word knowledge, though. Why put yourself in a category? I'm just trying to figure out if you actually think you're a Gnostic,
It
what
would
that
be
entails.
if I claim knowledge, if I claim Gnostic, it's still the same thing. It's just
So you're just
when people hear Gnostic, like I said, they think of the
yeah, I know.
heretical demiurge. So that's
Right. So you want to claim that title to carry a bit of controversy and then lay it out differently.
well, if
That's
anything, it's
what you're doing.
reclaiming the term, right? It should be correctly that we know God, which should be a sense of Gnosticism. We do know God exists. Otherwise, what are we arguing about? Even if those have belief and faith, there were some who did know God. And to say that people did know God means that there was Gnosticism.
Okay, well,
I mean, and plus, if God is alive to himself, then God does know himself in the same knowledge. It is self-gnosis.
I just I don't have much time, so I just landed it like at the 22-minute mark, and we'll just see what's going on.
The God of this world, the creator of this world, was not the high transcendental God. Now, Gnosticism recognizes there are contending forces. On the one hand, we have the Marian visions, we have the miracles that the saints performed. There is divine intervention. I think you can get help from the eons or the angels or whatever you want to call them. I'm a believer in healing miracles, divine intervention, the power of prayer. There's that side. On the other hand, there's a tremendous amount of evil. Obviously, the forces of good don't seem to be able to stop it. But this fits with what Gnostics say about the dualistic nature of this dimension. So what I did in the book God Reconsidered is I shared my journey over the last 50 years, 48 years to be exact. I'm 69 now, and how I finally went through all these different religions and finally decided that Gnosticism was the only path that really made philosophical sense.
Well, thank you, Scott. Jay, would you like to have a rebuttal? I know we said 5 minutes. If you need longer, then we'll just match. I'll have Scott match the timeline so everybody can say what they want to say.
I would definitely like to rebut to that. So I noted several points. I think in his opening statement, obviously he is free to give the opening statement that he wants, but the opening statement kind of ignored pretty much all the points that I made, most of which actually covered his responses or his points. So, for example, he sets what he calls fundamentalism over against whatever Gnostic version of Christianity that he has. I would actually say that, this is really a mischaracterization, because any position, any worldview actually has its own version of fundamentalism, you could say. In fact, I've even heard Mr. Smith critique scientism as being a kind of fundamentalism. So really any position could fall into, quote, fundamentalism, because any position will have fundamental starting points and presuppositions that it won't actually question. It's actually impossible to have no starting point.
Do you listen to Jay Dyer often?
Not really, no.
I find it funny that people ridicule him, but he makes himself a clown. He does really ridiculous little skits and music cringe videos, which he acts like a clown. But I think it's interesting how people try to point out that he's not good at arguing. He's not good at philosophy. I really don't see him falling to anybody. I see him always well articulated when he's talking to people. And that's all I want to say on that.
No foundational assumptions and complete neutrality. So I'd actually have to disagree that he may believe that he's philosophically neutral, and he may have striven or may strive to be neutral, but actually.
Oh, so he's going for a neutral position. What do you say on that, Tog?
For Jay, or
a neutral position at all? Does it exist?
you can be neutral if you're ignorant, yeah.
No,
Ignorance
you're in a position of ignorance. It's not neutral.
I mean, ignorance can be neutral if you have no knowledge. That's what I'm saying. And the fact that you have no knowledge of both sides, you're neutral because you.
You mean you have no knowledge of anything?
And are you talking about? You said no knowledge of a debate, and I'm saying depending on what the topic is where I'm coming from. If you don't know what the topic is, and there's two sides to that topic, but you're not aware of both sides, then yeah, you're ignorant to it. You can't have a side to lie on, unless it's presented to you. You didn't let me finish. So until the idea gets presented to you, then you can then formulate a side. But if you have it presented to you, there's no side.
It can also be pointed out that you do have a position that you're not aware of. You just haven't thought about it, or you're claiming neutrality. It can be worked out in a line of questioning. Because if you narrow it down to a God or not God world dichotomy, you get people who claim to be agnostic, right?
Right.
So you get into their behavior, their beliefs, and point out, okay, so they don't believe in God. They don't attribute facts with God as the necessity behind those facts. They don't live or pray to God. So they claim agnosticism, but their behavior shows that they're an atheist. This can be
They
pulled out of somebody.
they live in a God world, whether they like to or not, because they spend their time arguing about a God that doesn't exist.
Well, that's right. As a Christian, you do have that position where you're in the positive, saying you're suppressing God in unrighteousness. Romans 1:18. You take the position of a God world. If you can't get them to agree on a God versus not God world dichotomy, you can point out that they aren't neutral. They aren't living like God exists. They just don't want to call themselves atheists because that puts them in a position of making the hard claim. I think that's generally why it's avoided. Or the agnostic likes to play neutral. That's where you press them and show them that they have a position. They have a stance on these matters. It's just a matter of knowing how to navigate the line of questioning properly. And I think Jay Dyer is probably the master at that. As far
Well,
as
there's only one honest answer, right? For both atheists and agnostics. If the moment you start questioning about a God, even in a hypothetical, there has to be a God in order to have those questions.
well, if I start talking about a Glujubab in a hypothetical, does it have to be a Glujuba God existing? You know what I mean?
Well, that's what I'm saying. If there's a set things that comes with that, and that's already decided before us. So
What
this
do you
new
think
thing
about Dujabagaba?
you're missing the point because you're presenting something a new idea in a new form.
Yeah, a new
But
idea. What do you think about it?
that's what I'm saying though. It's not already a pre-established. You can't take something that hasn't been established. Like a lot. It's like
According to
imposing.
what rule?
It's like opposing when people say is Superman real? It's like that. It's on par with that same type of
Yeah,
argument.
yeah. He is on the screen. He is in our speech. We are talking about him. So there's a reality that exists around this Superman guy. Sure.
Right, but we know these things come back to a singular mind. And if they can be reduced back to something else, like Jagabujaga being reduced
Yeah.
back to you, then we know that it stems from you. So its origins can be placed. That's exactly my point.
But then I can get into how I heard that, how it
You
came
c-
to me,
You
how
could.
people told me about it, and then what are you going to do with that? That
Well,
negates what you just said, right?
if you're making a true argument that isn't going into absurdism, then yeah. Because if you're making the absurd point just to make a point, then your point is absurd.
Yeah, so I think this is what happens with Gnosticism when you try to pinpoint their epistemology is it leads in this direction where they just keep going back to the internal self, a circularity of autonomous reasoning. That's what I see in Gnosticism if questioned properly. It's just a guy saying, I know things, I don't know how I know things, I don't know how I can make you know the things I know, I just do. So it becomes it just is sort of an arbitrary autonomous claim of like, I just know because I know. That's
Yeah, I like
that's
that.
a problem in a discussion with someone who's geared to go after presuppositions, assumptions, and get into transcendental categories. I'm guessing that's what we'll see lay out here. I can't remember this.
Actually, neutrality is fundamentally impossible to achieve. There's no perfect neutral position because we're all conditioned in some sense by our worldviews. All of our views are theory laden, in other words, is what I'm trying to say. So the fact that he has cited Bart Ehrman, that he's cited these people who talk about Bible contradictions, there are many competent scholars who have replied to Bart Ehrman and others in many competent scholarly works, such as Dr. Craig Blomberg's book, The Reliability of the Gospels. I've done talks on the amazing historical veracity and testimony that we have in 5,000 plus manuscripts of the first, third, 3 and 4 centuries of the church. That's a tremendous attestation. That's much higher, magnitudes higher than what we have for Plato's dialogues. And as a grad student in philosophy, I know a lot about Plato. And I can tell you that the latest document that we have of Plato is Oxford Manuscript B of the Middle Ages. That's the earliest document that we have of Plato's writings. So we have within the first 3 or 4 centuries, over 5,000 manuscripts, even back to the first century, that are largely in harmony. There's something of a 95, 97, 98% harmony in the different textual collections and manuscripts that we have. So now that itself doesn't prove the religion. I'm just saying when it comes to the textual issues, it's a bit of sleight of hand to talk about fundamentalism, to throw in Bart Ehrman, when it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So are there difficulties in text? Yeah, there's difficulties in text, but actually there's difficulties in any religion. So as if this constitutes some sort of fundamental, like destructive argument to our position, I don't think it does, because any position, any religion, any worldview is going to have difficulties, right? He's going to bring up the problem of evil. He's kind of already hinted at that. I'm going to give you an argument for the problem of evil when we get to that question, when we get to theodicy, but actually pointing out these kinds of problems itself isn't an argument. We can point out fundamental problems. It can point us in a direction, but just talking about problems in a position itself isn't that strong of an argument, in my view. He says that Paul doesn't say much about Jesus's life. Well, this just assumes that Paul wasn't being chosen by Christ to be an apostle to the Gentiles, and that there wasn't in God's providence already going to be gospels written about Christ's life. In other words, it's assuming the thing that is kind of wanting that we need to be proven from the outset, which is that Christianity is false. In other words, he's assuming that Christianity is false in order to argue against the gospels. But we need to know why Christianity is false in order to disprove the gospels. That's the thing that he has not yet shown. So just because Paul doesn't talk about Jesus' life assumes that there must be a standard by which he will accept Paul's writings only if he talks about Jesus' life. Well, maybe Jesus didn't commission Paul to talk about his life because there's already 4 gospels that are going to be written talking about Jesus' life. When he talked about the atonement, he gave a Protestant definition of the atonement, which is not held by orthodoxy. You can read St. John Damascus's book, Exposition of the Orthodox Faith, where he goes into great depth in book 3, discussing how we don't believe in the idea that Christ's death was like one person had to be damned.
I'm guessing some people would call Jay Dyer a gish galloper. What do you think?
Because he runs on a lot, perhaps.
He just has like such complicated information that it gets hard to follow, like the way he understands these things.
So far, he's talking about how people view Jesus and claim to have Jesus, but don't take the gospel at it, right? So it's kind of hard for a Gnostic to say, well, the existence of Jesus is real, but the stories about the gospels about this man are not, right? They're mythological.
Oh, yeah.
That's
a huge conspiracy theory that you'd have to unpack. In fact, he couldn't do it.
He's trying to. Jay is trying to go through the idea, of that, explaining that about that. Not the dude's position, but yeah, that's his pretty much. He's just going about it a very slow way. Yeah. I don't know. The only thing I don't like is like some of the clip things, like the whole beta whatever type of mindset. I'm too not drawn to that stuff. Like some of on Jay Dyer's he talks about like beta males and things like that. I don't know if that goes into his lax joking, then perhaps, but
soy boys and stuff, slow boys. Yeah, the insults are a little much, but Dyer, I think Dyer's better studied, more well read than like Jim Bob and what's his face, the other
Andrew
guy.
Wilson.
Yeah, like they're more into the insults than Dyer, but I think that speaks to Dyer's level of education. He doesn't really need the insults, but he does engage in them for entertainment value.
Well, all 3 of them are Eastern Orthodox, if I remember correctly. So there's a question into why are these people who have to get, again, a clearing with the Eastern Orthodox in order to do this stuff, unless they're, there's a fine video where Halsey sent it to me. It's with Jim Bob and Andrew Wilson arguing, and it's on Pine Creek's channel. Dang, that whistle. And it's interesting because they kind of say that they can talk about debates about a Christian position, but they actually can't defend and talk about the Bible. So they can debate talk and political talk, but they can't debate you about the Bible because the church doesn't allow them to.
Oh, I did see Andrew Wilson saying that to somebody, and he's like, I never heard this before. What is this? Is that what you're talking about? Or does it do it often? Maybe.
No, it's I don't know. It's a video that he has that's on there. I never critiqued it. I was going to, but I just wasn't in the mindset to do so. But
Who is
even
he?
watching it, he's talking to Doug Pine Creek and someone else. I forget who.
Oh yeah, I
Uh,
did watch that recently. Yeah, he's like the church doesn't give me the authority to speak on those matters. I thought it was kind of I hadn't heard it either. It's kind of interesting, really, because what the hell's Doug going to do about that? Doug is a clown in the fact that he's like the sophist who is like, oh, you have a transcendental argument, I'm going to have a transcendental argument type of guy. It's like, no, it doesn't work. Like he thinks it's clever, and he has 50,000 people who are like, yeah, get him, Doug. You're the man. It's like it's not.
Get him,
It's
Doug.
not just to borrow somebody's argument to try to prove a point. You only get so far. He doesn't get to say, "Oh yeah, I have a transcendental argument for like." It's like breakfast tacos is the more.
That's a
extreme.
weird one though, because I'll use this analogy. If we're borrowing, like let's say they're borrowing the keys, right? If their key starts up their car, then how can you say that it only belongs to you?
Well, we're not talking about a car. We're talking about the fundamental principles in your argument about the preconditions necessary, starting with the God of the Bible, not the preconditions necessary, starting with natural things, and then getting in and assuming metaphysics.
Oh, I think you can make an argument for such.
You can't. People
You
try to
can.
borrow the transcendental argument and posit a different God. If you know how the argument works, you can overcome your opponents. I've seen Jay Dyer do it. They're missing elements by trying. In fact, people have tried the Tang, the transcendental argument for not God. It's just a mess. It's just puts logic as the ultimate presupposition, but logic is only a consistency tool. It doesn't have an explanatory power of the preconditions of reality. So it's just becomes nonsense if you know how to.
Well, yeah, as much as it goes into sci-fi, you could conceive of a godless world, right, or godless origin, and then everything's already gone through entropy, and that God has just come upon that scene of entropy, and resurrected everything to its into a state that in which it has designated itself into this system. And in that sense, it's still a godless origin, and there's a God being introduced. It's not emerging. It's part of a natural timeline a chain of events. You don't have to say timeline. I was going to say timeline, but it's a natural chain of events that potentially could transpire.
That sounds like how
the
what Breakfast Tacos is trying to do to you, get you to concede to the possibility of a godless world. The thing about that is you can say, sure, that's a possibility in a sense that I can think of that, but it goes against my worldview, which I'm arguing against the impossibility to the contrary. So where I can conceive that and entertain that thought with you, it's not my position, and I wouldn't claim it would be dishonest for me to say so. You kind of stop him from moving forward there. You just say, sure, I can recognize that could be a situation, but it goes against the stability of my argument.
I actually don't know if it does go against the stability of our arguments as Christians. As a fundamental origin, because that still explains like a God hovering over the depths and stuff.
Well, I'm saying as a presuppositionalist, you don't go, oh yeah, I guess a godless world
could
be possible. You say that's not possible. It goes against my argument.
For you, yeah, I forget, because you're free stuff in that regard. Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah,
but it still would be. It still wouldn't be godless because again, in the sequence of events, the lineal time of that God had still existed in parallel, even though everything was destroyed. So, like I said, in the chain of events, it never not existed. It just wasn't an adjacent reality, if you want to call it that, or adjacent existence. So it was still pre-existing. It doesn't actually go against presup.
What is pre-existing?
That God in the adjacent reality would still exist alongside if a known universe was completely already decayed, and then this God came and revived it. The part of it being godless and the fact that it went through its death, and then this God just emerges on the scene and revives it all. That's still a godless origin, but that still has God there also, because God's was still there in adjacent reality. It doesn't take away
Which
that
God are you
God
talking
being
about?
there. The God, like the God of the Bible. Like I said, that's why I said it gets into sci-fi language. But it's a hypothetical on if God, like if the whole
I don't
universe was
know. I
dead.
mean, I would challenge how you know these things based on the scriptures. It sounds like you're just
I even went into it as an explanation of the depth of the deep and things coming out of that. Let there be light. Let there be blah blah blah. Those aren't as much as those are commands of creation. Um, they're works. So it's like making and fasting something. So if you're restoring something, right? Because it's like if you ever watch restoration videos, then that's that bara. You're bringing it back, right?
yeah.
You're fixing it.
Bring it back to the subject matter. I'm getting lost in what you're saying.
All right, now we can just skip it then and
I'm
just
sorry.
continue the video. No, that's fine.
Okay.
By another person in the Trinity or something like this, as if that paid off God. That's the Western Anselmian and then later Protestant doctrine. Orthodox Christianity does not believe in that doctrine, as it would necessitate a form of Nestorianism. He says that we would have to dispense with the evidence for evolution. Actually, I debate evolutionists all the time, and there's not much evidence for evolution. There's evidence for adaptation, sure, but adaptation is not the same thing as this grand scale narrative of Darwinian evolutionary theory. So I'll be happy to debate any of the points that relate to the grand scale narrative of Darwinian theory, and we'll be happy to dispense with them. So he talks about pointless suffering. I imagine we'll get to that when we get to theodicy, because theodicy actually presupposes a standard by which to judge right and wrong, good and bad, suffering, why suffering is bad. And what we need is justification for.
I feel like Scott Smith is probably like, okay, why did someone tell me to debate this guy? Like he's getting kind of, a little bit itchy here. Like, I know this is just speculation, but I'm kind of feeling that.
Why there are those standards. And of course, I believe that the Orthodox philosophy gives a justification for that. When it comes to New Testament citations for the deity of Christ, I already gave one. Christ says many times in the Gospel of John, I am. He identifies himself with the I am. This is why the Jews want to stone him, right? Isaiah, in John 11, John cites Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees the majesty of the seraphim covering the face of God. It's identified as God. John specifically identifies that as Jesus. So the so-called Gnostic gospel, John, many people thought John in the early church might be a Gnostic gospel, ironically identifies Christ as God. John 1 begins with, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John 1:18, it says that he is the only begotten of the Father. So we believe that Christ quite literally is God. And there's many, many other cases. I did a 3-hour talk just on citations from the Old and New Testament. You can find that whole talk if you want to go into that. I obviously don't have time for that now. It's called Is Jesus God? Is God a Trinity? And it's a response to Rocking Mr. E, the well-known YouTuber. So lastly, as my time winds down here, I'm trying to fit this in as quick as I can. He says that why would God withhold knowledge of germs? Well, this is a bizarre argument because really, again, this would be an argument that I think would befall any position
Todd, did he get that argument from you?
Well, the knowledge of withholding germs.
That sounds like something you'd say in the middle of a conversation. Why would God withhold germs? Like,
yeah, right. No, like that. Even I wouldn't think that. Like, even I think that's obtuse because, again, if God, this is what I think. If there was never knowledge of a thing, we'd never be able to talk about it.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Knowledge is intrinsic. Knowledge is intrinsic to revelation, right? And the things that are revealed, like you can't have. What do you mean? Because you know about it, right? And knowledge is identical to the Spirit of God. So that's what I'm saying. Like you can't take away these fundamentals.
Well, yeah, that's what I was getting into. The hostile Hyperborean guy is I was pointing out that metaphysics and epistemology are connected. There must be something for you to know that exists to claim knowledge, and then at the same time, for something to exist, and you pointed out that's a knowledge claim. So they're entangled with one another, but secular philosophy likes to separate them. right? Epistemology and metaphysics. But it's interesting when you start realizing that you can't really have one without the other.
In other words, it's a kind of an unanswerable question for anybody's worldview. It's like saying, why would we not have knowledge of why did Jesus not talk about computers? I don't find that a very convincing argument, because if Christianity is true, then in God's providence, God knows and has a delineated period within which he does lead man to certain levels of knowledge, again, depending upon God's foreknowledge and God's providence. There's nothing within the Christian worldview where that's inconsistent. So I'm not sure why that's a suitable argument, because it just assumes that God is evil or bad for not letting people know about germs a long time ago. But again, now we have to know why, on what standard, on what basis he's going to judge things evil and bad. And this leads me to my final point, which is that when he says that he is a believer in divine intervention, how does he know, or by what standard does he have an ability or a way to judge whether these divine interventions, these mystical experiences, these ideas of why he should or should not do this thing are absolute, or maybe they're not absolute? And if they're not absolute and they're relativistic, then on what basis?
It's great points. He's going into epistemology and ethics, right? Like, if you're going to be a Gnostic, how are you going to claim you know these specific things, and what's the guideline about the right and wrong, about how to handle this knowledge from this Gnostic view? This is where he's going to fall short. I'm going to rewind that.
Does this experience an intervention? How does he know, or by what standard does he have an ability or a way to judge whether these divine interventions, these mystical experiences, these ideas of why he should or should not do this thing are absolute, or maybe they're not absolute? And if they're not absolute and they're relativistic, then on what basis does this mystic position that he has give him any better standing, any better philosophical stance than any other position?
Yeah, that's really the crux of the matter as I see it. What do you think?
Yeah, because without your standard, and how do you get to that standard is another good point.
Well, how do you get to it? God is the standard. It's presupposed. If you want to get to it autonomously, then you have to explain how your autonomous philosophy brought you to God, and why you would rely on the autonomous philosophy as a foundation instead of God as the foundation. It's like an order of steps that you take. And in fact, I see you taking that step, or at least I hope you do.
I would say that what you said is kind of impossible, like taking a step towards God, because this is what I mean by that. Even though we take a step close, he may take a step back.
No,
And
he's the standard.
Hold up. What I mean by that is that we are the only way we seem to come to God is if we're drawn by him to come to him. So
we also
we can seek God, right? We can seek God, but that doesn't mean that God is actually like listening in, which is why prayer is necessary, and people praying on your behalf is necessary and whatnot.
Well, why would you say he's not listening? Are you saying maybe he doesn't answer in the way you want him to?
No, I think that just has to do with the sins that people do.
I'm saying, why are you saying God isn't listening in certain circumstances?
Like literally for that reason, for the sins in which we do.
So if you sin a certain amount, he stops listening to you? Like,
that's usually the get-go, right? Yeah.
I guess I see, yeah.
Yeah.
Atheism or than Christianity at all. It seems that it would just reduce to pure relativism.
Well, thank you, Jay. Yes, looks like Vance, everybody's behaving in the chat room.
Can I?
That was a great ending there. That's kind of what you want to do with breakfast tacos type, is you just want to keep driving towards relativism, which you basically have to commit to it at some point if you can point it out well enough, and then they're done. But you have to be able to finish that too and point out how it's just moving on a spectrum without a standard, and you can't really get to any answers or any knowledge.
I'd like to ask them if they would know for certainty if there was never the subject of God, would they be in the same position?
Well, how could they answer that?
Well, it's just curious, because they're already in a godless world. So how's, if there's never any Bible, how are they going to answer? Because there's no God. So what are they going to? They're already in a godless world.
Hmm.
So right, like what
Yeah,
are they
I'm gonna-
doing?
I
It's weird. It's weird, right?
just wanted
Yeah, I mean that's what you have to do is you're like, okay, this guy's giving me this information, it's not adding up. So you have the task of like pointing out how it's the metaphysics, epistemology, and ethic are disconnected somewhere. Usually, it's interesting because the ethic seems to be the easiest to go after, but the hardest to get people to understand. They don't want to think that you can just dismiss them because they're coming into a conversation with
Well, if you
relatives.
think about it,
It's kind
yeah,
of
like
hard.
going back to the relative, there was a certain point in which they weren't doing. It's not like they were born and bred to argue against the existence of a God that isn't there. So why did they start engaging with it, and where did it become more beneficial in their life? Or is it because they come from the X belief position, right? So they're not like genuine atheists in the sense that um they were brought up in it, but they only come to the realization that there wasn't a God, and so they want to combat that. Like, and that's fine, I guess, because people can do whatever they want. But if I'm talking about like a atheist that never was in faith, what brought you to the point of arguing against like that
Yeah.
there's a God, right? Because that doesn't make sense. I
Don't
can
you
understand an ex-believer. Yeah.
Yeah, don't you think that that's a great platform to get into ethics? Because ultimately, don't you think they're saying that God's a big meanie, me no like God, slavery?
I don't like this idea of something that isn't there, that people wrote down that are long dead, that somehow,
But aren't they ultimately
it's
emotional
weird.
about it, saying God's a meanie, God's not just? That's when you get into those categories with them. Like, how do you
Well,
account for justice? How do you account for meaning? And that's the transcendental categories that they
it's
get
more or
lost.
less. Well, it's not even that. It's the same imagine evil, but even worse. They don't imagine this evil from
It's not.
an imagination. They imagine the evil onto people. So it's the practitioners
No, it's
onto
not.
the
It's
Christians.
never substantiated what evil is, though, from a godless worldview. It's just relative. Like, look at that. I don't like that. Don't do that. I don't like that. I don't like when you do that to me. That's all it is. You can reduce it to a preference, which is what you want to do, because when you reduce the worldview to a preference on an ethical level, it bleeds through the epistemology and ethics where you're saying, well, I don't really know what right and wrong are, or even if I'm correct about the information and you agree with me, I can't tell you how to handle the information.
Well,
You remember
the
the
only,
Gnostic the other night when I
right.
said, "Odd, I take you seriously." He's like, "No," and that's when I exited. Like, I see that as the correct
Yeah.
exit at that point, because he's saying, "No, you shouldn't take me seriously."
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, no, that's idiot. I love that. That was good. Like, but yeah, I like that part. That was funny. But in the same breath, God, I was gonna say something. Give me a minute. Oh, I lost it because you said the thing. That's all right.
All right, maybe it'll come back to you.
to interject. Yes, we'll let you. I just wanted to check everybody's behaving. I'm amazed the reaction that my vaping is getting from people. Sorry, but I only smoke crack outside. So, but that's where we are. So everybody's behaving. Yeah, and I'm amazed how the word boomer has become such an insult. I'm Gen X. I'm Gen X. But anyway, Scott, please give us your rebuttal. Jay went about 7 minutes, so please 7
Yeah,
minutes.
I don't have a lot to say, except that I wanted to clarify a few things. First of all, when I say fundamentalism, I'm distinguishing that somewhat from the evangelical point of view. I'm not saying that none of us have some presumptions. I explained in God Reconsidered how I came to my decision. People can read it and they will either agree with my logic or they will decide that I'm wrong. I'm simply saying
Oh,
that.
sorry.
I remember what I was gonna say. It was about your comment about preferences, but there can be preferences that come at default, and that's I think the genuine question is like, although there are these preferences to choose from, some of them I guess we can phrase it, can some of them be set to a default into which we gauge these things, and because it's set to like a default, that would be an objective preferences, right? Because it's set to
What do you mean
uh
set to a default?
So like the way I was thinking as like an analogy, like if I go into my music DAW and I'm trying to change those preferences, like all those preferences are preferences in which I can change, but there's only so many that I can. I can't go outside that preference box. And if I do, then
Yeah.
I'm like either jailbreaking or modding, something akin to that, right? It's possible, I guess you could say, to
Well,
do such a thing, but
the choices you could say in this analogy are based on a standard as well, right? Like they all
right,
come from a source or a standard in which their preferences, you can trace them back to a commonality.
right. In our case, we say God, right? Because in his spirit, they say biology and chemical process or something akin to that.
The biology and chemical processes don't give you the philosophy that explains the inner workings of the
I
things
imagine
you're
it's
claiming, so that the believer can point this out, because they're going to assume transcendental
ah,
categories in their explanation. So you have to stop them and say, how do you know that? How do you know that? It gets quite tedious, and it seems like you're nagging them, but you don't want to let them just smuggle in stuff unaccounted for. So,
they might switch it up to brute facts. I think I would if I'm arguing with myself and
oh,
just say, well,
you would. What is a brute fact?
a brute fact, it's just the way it is. It just
Yeah, it
is.
just is
Right?
arbitrary metaphysic.
Like the
That's
world, like the fact that we breathe oxygen is it just is a brute fact that because it's what is reality.
well, I mean, what
Whether
are
it
you
was
what kind
caused
of
that
information?
way, yeah,
What
whether
kind
it
of
was caused
information
that
are
way
you
or
getting?
not by design or
Mhm.
not is what I'm saying. Then we still
Well,
breathe oxygen.
you can take an example like breathing oxygen and try to move it forward, but what is the example really telling you? This is these subject matters are deeper than breathing oxygen. He's being questioned on how he knows the things that he's proclaiming, how he understands and can account for transcendental categories as a Gnostic. This is what Jay Dyer did to Matt Dillahunt. He pinned him down on the it just is metaphysics. He said, like, we use logic, we presuppose it, it just is. And he pointed out to Matt, like, if you're going to say it just is, you're arbitrary in your foundation. And also the defeater for that, if you want to take this route, is you could say, this is not my argument, but now based on your arbitrary it just is, me saying God just is would actually trump the discussion, because God is prior to what you're claiming just is. You can make that move of God just is when they try that.
Vision, people can read it and they will either agree with my logic or they will decide that I'm wrong. I'm simply saying that Jay's position is a very conservative one within Christianity. There are lots of other faithful, scholarly Christians who would disagree with him on many of these things. The second point is with regard to the manuscripts. I didn't say anything about the manuscripts. Yes, there's great consistency between the manuscripts. What I'm talking about are the dramatic contradictions that are obvious to anybody once your eyes are opened. And I think anybody who wants to understand this should read Richard Smoley.
You see, like, little claims like that, like Gnostic claims, once your eyes are opened, it's like, what the hell does that mean? Where are you leading me with that?
The
Like,
poetry language, yeah.
it's like, oh yeah,
I love Gnostic stories, dude. They're the best in that. They're really good as for art and artists and symbology and meaning and like storytelling. Like you can pull a lot as a creator, in art, like for writing things down from Gnostic texts.
but
Wonderful.
isn't it essentially borrowing from the Christian worldview? Can you see how that can be the case?
You could say borrowing, but like where does their knowledge of argumentation lie, right? They
lies in the autonomous reasoning, like literally lies, deception.
right, but like I meant like their origin of their deity is all I mean. Like where did that knowledge come from? Like it really goes back into the weird many portion.
The problem.
Hold up, yeah, I'll be right back. I need to see what's happening in my son's room. But go ahead and press play.
All right.
Who wants to understand this should read Richard Smoley's how God became God, in which he addresses why Christ was crucified. He says it's because he probably did convey the idea that he was the Messiah, and he explains what the Jewish concept of the Messiah was. And Bart Ehrman's Jesus Interrupted, I think, makes a very, very clear case. There's not a book that has ever been written that doesn't have its critics, and people can choose their sides. But I'm very confident that most people who approach this objectively will realize that the New Testament and the Old
Approach this objectively, huh? So that might be a reference back to his alleged neutral position. Like, I'm gonna look at this information objectively, open-minded. Yeah, but you're bringing in presuppositions and assumptions. It's probably where Jay Dyer would move on that.
Testament are not infallible. Now, with regard to the atonement, I didn't say what I didn't get into any details about which theory. There's half a dozen theories of why Christ had to die. But as far as as Paul's not lack
Hey,
of
Jay.
discussion or even reference
I have
Yeah.
to
I have to run.
Okay. See you
Thank
next
you
time.
for the
man.
time. Yep.
All
Have a
right,
good
man.
one. Bye. God
care.
bless.
Christ's life. Paul, if you just take the 7 letters that everybody agrees are the legitimate ones, Paul had opinions about everything. Wasn't always clear,
Yeah.
but
Everyone agrees in what? A group of people he knows, a lot of people that he's heard, about 7 of the epistles being accurate. This is going to be a huge conspiracy theory that he's going to have to hash out to say these epistles are right, these are wrong. It's like a dirty varmint, A's philosophy type of stance, even a universalist type of stance. They tried to pick which part of the Bible they think is right. It's going to be a position of endless problems. If you go into the scriptures saying this is right, this is wrong, well, you've challenged the integrity of the scriptures themselves. How can you ever know which parts are right and wrong? How can you differentiate the two? What operating system are you using to critique that? So that becomes the question.
Christ's life. Paul, if you just take the 7 letters that everybody agrees are the legitimate ones,
Like that right there, like nice smuggle. If you just take the 7 that everyone agrees on, like, no, dude, there's no way I hope Dyer took a note on that, but he's got plenty to work with anyway.
Paul had opinions about everything. Wasn't always clear, but what is clear is he only cites Jesus twice, and he barely makes any reference to his life, which, again, the contrast with the Gospels.
Paul barely makes reference to Christ's life. That's a new one.
Is enormous, but the Gospels don't agree among themselves. The contradictions are enormous, and rather than go any further into where we have some disagreements here about suffering and so forth, we'll leave that when we get on to theodicy. So let's move on.
All right. Well, then let's move on.
He just gave Dyer a bunch of more material to work with. Like, this should be pretty easy for Dyer.
On to theodicy. Jay, would you like to talk about that or rebut any of Scott's points?
The only thing I would say is that, again, the alleged contradictions have been dealt with. To appeal to what is an obvious contradiction or what should be obvious is very similar to the way that higher critics approached the book of Genesis, for example. They would argue things like, well, if you look at the fact that there's 2 different names of God being used, say in one chapter of Genesis as opposed to another chapter, or the way that the Leviticus text utilized a different name, a presupposition there is that had to have been different authors, and therefore we could deny Mosaic authorship or deny later redactions by Joshua, and therefore the whole manuscript tradition would fall apart into the documentary hypothesis and so forth. But the problem is that the documentary hypothesis rests on presuppositions. And what's ironic is that in the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century, the documentary hypothesis about the Old Testament itself is no longer in favor. The hypothesis of Q, that there was this mythical Q document that served as the basis for perhaps Mark's earliest gospel, or what Mark being the earliest gospel and so forth. No, Q is no longer in favor. You can go watch Yale University's YouTube channel, the latest lectures at Yale. They'll tell you that this is no longer in vogue when it comes to textual scholarship. So actually textual scholarship of Bart Ehrman and the liberal variety is a shifting sand. It's always changing, much like Darwinism is a shifting sand that's always changing. In fact, think about something like junk DNA. Junk DNA, according to, say, Richard Dawkins 15 years ago, was the strongest proof of Darwinian theory and evolution. And then there's a clip of Dawkins not too long ago saying that junk DNA is one of the strongest things that he now rejects. He never supported junk DNA. In fact, there is no junk DNA. And people have put the two clips of him side by side. Now, I'm not trying to say that attribute to Mr. Smith, Dawkins' position, but I know that he is a critic of scientism, as I would be as well. But I would just simply point out that this critique about the alleged disharmony in the Gospels has been dealt with since the beginning, right? The church fathers have dealt with this. Augustine wrote a whole book about the harmony of the Gospels. And this partly gets into, again, difficulties when it relates to textual traditions. He says he wasn't interested in talking about different textual manuscripts, but it's actually relevant because there's a distinction that we would make between the autographa, which is the text that the apostles and the disciples actually penned, and then the later copies or manuscripts that come to us in these different textual codices, right? Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, et cetera, the received text and so forth. So that's a big, difficult issue. I don't deny that. But setting aside that question of presuppositions when it comes to textual manuscripts, there's an amazing, again, connection between countless messianic prophecies that Christ specifically fulfilled. How would Christ have fulfilled those prophecies? In other words, that's what we would expect if these were inspired documents. And again, Christ himself refers to himself as the fulfillment of those many, many, many prophecies. So again, I have a whole talk on that. I know we're not going to get into fulfilled prophecies, but you could look at Daniel 7, Daniel 9. Daniel talks about the exact empires under which the Messiah would be born. The temple would be destroyed. The sacrifice would be done away. And of course, in 70 AD, that's exactly what happened. Christ dies, right? And then 70 AD, the temple's destroyed by Titus Vespasian. The temple administration is taken away. Daniel says this would happen when the final era comes upon us. We live in that church era, which all of the prophets of the Old Testament, almost all of them, said that what would mark that messianic era would be the Gentiles worshiping the God of the Jews, the God of the Israelites. And that's exactly what's happened in the last 2,000 years. The apostles and their followers have gone out and converted the Gentile nations to worship the one true God. And that's what we say Jesus is. Now, when it comes to theodicy, what I would say is that this is where I think it's going to get very hairy for the opponent, because I listened to many of his talks, actually most of the ones that I could find on YouTube in preparation for this debate. So I don't want to be unfair to him, but I noticed many times where when he laid out his worldview, what he said was something to the effect of, for example, he said, we can have a Hindu, Buddhist, shaman conception of a religion that we kind of formulate like a cafeteria. We can kind of put it together the way that we want to do it. And he says, then we can somehow get like a version of good and evil. And I would just simply say that, number one, his position cannot give any coherent explanation of what good and evil is. And so therefore, when he would attempt to critique Christianity on the basis of, oh, Jehovah is a mean God of the Old Testament, or something like the Yalda Baal.
Yeah, there it is, right? Coming in with the concept of good and evil that's not accounted for, wanting to claim God as a big meanie. So Jay Dyer says, oh, okay. You can claim what you want about God. You know, how do you know? What are right and wrong from your worldview? What is good and evil? He's abandoning the scriptures. So now he's got this autonomous version of good and evil, which good luck with Jay Dyer him not reducing you to, oh, it's my feelings, my preferences.
Right, the demiurge or whatever. I would actually say that he has no grounding and no fundamental basis by which to critique good and evil at all, because in his worldview, good and evil, as best I could tell from the many lectures and interviews of his that I listened to, it's purely subjective. If it's
There it is, right?
purely subjective, then there's no basis that's objective to critique our God on. You need some kind of metaphysical absolute, a concrete absolute, the good or something.
This is what the lackeys who go against transcendental arguments try to do. They just try to assume transcendental categories and assume an ethic. And when you stop them and say, how are you even going to critique me if you don't know good from bad, good from evil? It's a stopper. They're going to continue to talk and continue to argue, but it's there to be a stopper. Perhaps after the debate, to save face, or either one of those, he gets it. It's like, oh yeah, I guess I can't really point out someone's wrong when I just have the idea of wrong that I've come up with. That would just be my preference versus theirs.
Something has to be objectively a transcendental necessary category. And if you don't have that, if you don't have a philosophical justification for that, then your position is just relativism, it's pure subjectivism, and it actually can't say anything at all.
Yeah, that's great. That's exactly what pretty much every position over at Ace Theos channels, unbelievers and alleged believers alike, because they reduce the ethical component of their worldview into subjectivism. So whatever they bring to the table is going to come down to, yeah, that's very interesting and articulate, but how do I handle that? What is right? What is wrong? Oh, well, that's just up to you. Oh, okay, well, then I reject it because I don't like it. Next.
All right, thank you, Scott. I think Jay went about 7 minutes, if that's what you want for the rebuttal on theodicy. I must say, somebody did mention in chat that you look like a thin Bruce Dern. I think that's a compliment as far as I'm concerned. But
well, that beats the person who posted on Facebook that I've already converted them to orthodoxy from my apparently
just by your looks.
So, okay, I am not a relativist. I am a believer in evil. By profession, I'm a journalist. I've written.
Oh, nice. That's great. He's not a relativist. Like, got to jump on that, right? Let's get into that.
Extensively about Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, all the great.
Yeah, they're big meanies, right? They're not nice.
Evil leaders in the world. I've studied prehistory and history, and what I'm defining as evil, or let's say bad.
See right there, what I'm defining as evil or bad. He's not a relativist, but he's now telling you he's a subjectivist. Relativism is actually a step up from subjectivism in a sense that it takes into account the group's subjective preferences and opinions and tries to move that to an objective. But he's saying I'm not a relativist, but he seems to be saying he's a subjectivist here.
It is not subtle. I lived in Germany for a while. I've been to a death camp. I would call the Holocaust evil. I think that any God who created a reality where a quarter of the children would die in.
So here we get into emotional language based on the preference of what he thinks is evil, right? Like, I don't like this. I don't think this should be based on what I said evil is. That's all Dyer's likely going to do, is just show him that he's in an autonomous circle of subjectivism. He can't move forward. But this is why he's trying to lump on the emotional language, because people respond to this.
In childhood, for all the suffering and the innocence and the grief of the families, a God who would create a world where there is famine, where people weren't even literate until recent, where nobody had any idea what the Black Death was caused by. 40% of Europe in the Middle Ages died of that, and it was an excruciating, horrible Ebola-like death. Cancer is not proportionate.
Proportionate to what, dude?
Yeah, both religions, East and West, in their desperation to justify a god or a power like karma that would have us come into this world, they try to blame the victim, and they try to say one of several things.
So he's got good and evil and victims in his worldview, which is subjective opinion. This is very easy to knock down. He's just boo-hooing right now. And I'm not saying that, like, the points about, vicious world leaders and disease and childhood deaths is a light subject, but it doesn't bring us to the truth or falsity of the matter of the existence of good and evil and the account for it in our conversation. It's just bringing in emotional language to get people to side with what you're saying. But when you pick apart and dismantle what's being said, it's just these are things I don't like.
Things. Either it's all relative. How can you say that, there's good or evil, which is what the liberals usually do? Or they'll say, well, it's a mystery. We can learn things from our suffering. They've done studies, and it shows that in 3 months, almost everybody can, on average, bounce back from adversity, whether it's being in a death camp or a divorce or, getting a cancer prognosis, whatever it is. And human beings are very, very resilient. And I'm an expert on adversity. My day job is very mundane. I interview CEOs and find out how they succeeded. And resilience is part of that formula. So what I'm saying is that in order to understand whether Genesis is correct, when God rests on the seventh day and said that his creation is good, you have to see what that means. Now, if you believe in the dinosaurs who were around for 150 million years, it's a little hard to understand why God or the aliens or whoever was in charge of the creation process, if it didn't happen 6,000 years ago, why they hung around for so long. Did God finally say, well, something, after 150 million years, this doesn't seem to be leading to...
This is just speculation. This is nothing.
Human beings who kind of modern humans really only appeared about 60,000 years ago. What was the purpose of this long, very, very slow
purpose? Another transcendental category he's smuggling in.
Creation by any definition. And then he brought in the asteroids. How do we explain the purpose of volcanoes, hurricanes, tsunamis? What it looks like is exactly what we see day to day. Accidents, chaos, from the quantum level up to...
Accidents. To say accidental or accidents assumes a correct path, which he can be questioned on, which he doesn't know.
Industrial accidents. The fundamental problem with all mainstream religions is this notion that, and this is in the East too, is that we get born here for a purpose. Let's say to learn the truth, and Christians don't even agree on what that is. Obviously, Bart Ehrman and his critics don't agree on what the New Testament is saying, or whether certain doctrines like divorce should be ignored. Should abortion be a major principle of modern Christianity, or should it be a minor one? The bottom line is that it's very, very hard for people to find the truth. And this is after people have become literate. What about the tens of thousands of years when most people spent their entire lives farming? The irony of this notion that God placed us here in order to exercise our free will is, first of all, it completely denies the fact that God is responsible for creating us. that we are largely products of genetics and environment. If you read a book like Harville Hendricks's Getting the Love You Want, you learn very convincingly that it's in the first months of life, certainly the first year of life, that we largely get programmed, and we end up, picking inappropriate spouses, and we are subconscious. Even Paul said, I do things that I don't really want to do. We don't understand ourselves. Very few people have been through psychotherapy to become more self-aware, be more objective. And the bottom line is that somehow God waves this magic wand that says, you have free will, therefore, whatever you do, you're going to be held accountable for. And yet, nobody can really hardly even find the time to search for truth if it were easy to find. I mean, our lives are a third taken up with, commuting, work, study. Third is taken up with sleep, a third with games and eating and, other things. Very, very little of anybody's life, especially if you go back 60,000 years, is.
Yeah, he sure has a lot of faith, right? To going back 60,000 years. Yeah, if you just go back 60,000 years, yeah, I mean, you have faith in all these reports of civilizations 60,000 years ago. This is a wild philosophical claim here.
Taken up with any opportunity to quote unquote exercise free will, but even free will becomes subject to the accidents of the world. The chaos in the world is
it accidents or is it chaos? Right, because accidents assume a correct path. Chaos is not that. So is he using those interchangeably?
quote unquote exercise free will, but even free will becomes subject to the accidents of the world. The chaos in the world is everywhere. Some innocent person a mile away gets killed by.
How does a Gnostic have a universal claim like accidents in the world? The chaos in the world is everywhere. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a reasonable assumption, but you can challenge this knowledge claim. How does the Gnostic have access to a universal claim about everywhere?
A bullet. A person who didn't know that a building was going to collapse is killed, and so forth and so on. There just really isn't any rhyme or reason to the notion that this world was created by a benevolent God.
Well, thank you, Scott. Well, Jay, would you like to rebut? I think we're.
So think about, like, he ends it with it's unreasonable or whatever he said to think that this world was created by a benevolent God. You just go right back to, like, what is benevolence? What is good? What is evil? He doesn't have that information. He's just decided when he opened, this is how I'm going to define it because I studied Mao, Stalin, and Hitler and other things. He's just given a load of information that's quite easy to work with.
We're on theodicy, but I think free will might be another why we gravitate to religions. Why is there evil, and do we have free will at all? Or go ahead, tell us what you. Go ahead.
Well, the first thing I noticed was that when he responded on the matter of theodicy, he basically responded that, well, children die, God lets a lot of people die, and therefore that's just not nice. That's emotional.
Right, there it is. That's not nice. I don't like that. God is a meanie.
So you can make an emotional appeal, but in debate, an emotional appeal is a fallacy. It's not actually a valid argument.
And you just did that for 70% of what you just said, sir.
So I would, again, reiterate the point that I asked before, because I know that he says he does believe that there's evil. He believes that there is some way to adjudicate between these. But what I was asking for is what precisely is the means by which we adjudicate between good and evil? How does he know when such and such mystical experiences, maybe it was a demon, maybe it was an evil spirit, maybe an archon deceived him into believing that this experience that he had, this mystical.
The reason he's going to these wild claims is because he's pointing out Scott is leaving these ideas on the table as possibilities based on his own worldview. So they become a problem. You can make a case against him with these wild ideas he's coming up, and Scott will have a problem trying to dismantle the claim against him.
experiences talking to whatever entity. How does he know that it wasn't an archon deceiving him? In other words, he needs a standard by which to judge between the good and the evil. I specifically asked what that standard is, and I didn't hear one, even though.
Yes. And pay attention to that whenever you're talking to anyone about good and evil. What is the standard?
I said, even though I did hear him say he believes that there is evil, I would like to know what the epistemic justification is for whatever his standard of good and evil is when he says he's not a relativist. So that's good.
So, Jade, are going for the jugular there, the epistemic justification. That's what the Gnostic doesn't have. That is an area of fail. It's just saying, I believe these things because I know these things in some manner.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, but I'd like to know how he's not a relativist. Next, I've heard him say, and I could be wrong, maybe it wasn't him, but there was other people talking in different interviews. But I did hear somebody mention in one of the Ian Bite shows that
Timothy, ultimate authority, right? That's where this conversation is moving. But he also pointed out there, he said he's not a relativist, but I still have yet to hear how he's not. So he was pointing out that he's still going to fall in that category. That's what I love about learning these arguments is you can show people how they're in a position that they don't even realize they're in. The hard part about this is the response of the person you're doing that to. They absolutely hate that, but this is why the gentle approach is key, because you're basically pulling the rug out. So are you going to be nasty about it, or are you going to be gentle about it? This is where you're called to adhere to the Spirit in how you reason in these matters.
That we could look at reality as being grounded in mind. I actually make this argument quite often. It may not have been his argument, so forgive me if it wasn't. But if it was his argument, I would reiterate that I agree that reality does seem to have mind at its fundamental basis. And in fact, this is a classic argument that many church fathers made. St. Maximus the Confessor made this argument that reality manifests logos, the logi of reality, the essences of things. You could think about this kind of like Plato's forms, the essences of things, right? And numbers could be another example of this. Immaterial, invariant, abstract entities like numbers, they seem to go beyond the mere physical. Where are they, though? How are they interacting in this world, but also beyond this world, right? Also outside of the flux of space and time. Well, the church fathers and many theologians in the Orthodox tradition have said, well, the answer to this is the divine mind, right? The logos is the fundamental basis of all reality, and therefore reality is at base personal. And so the reason I bring that up is that this is not just an abstract thing about trying to prove arguments for math problems. It's actually pointing to the fundamental nature of reality being personal, and not just humanly personal, but divine personhood. And that's you.
Oh, hey, Carrie. Good to see you. I've actually got to, I got to get going, so I'll probably pop on later. We'll see what happens. Take care, guys. God bless you.